So this one particular article was really the only one that I had written straight from the heart. And I didn't plan on publishing it. I just thought it was for me. But when I realized it was helpful to me, I thought, all right, maybe it will help somebody else. But I really didn't give much context. Nobody knew the backstory of why I wrote it. It was literally just a list of the 13 things with a little explanation of each one. And, you know, before I knew it, it was a couple of days after I wrote it, and Forbes magazine picked it up, and pretty soon news stations from across the world were calling me to talk about it. But people thought I wrote it because I'd mastered it. Nobody knew I wrote it because I was struggling with it. So I was thankful that in the course of all of that, a literary agent called and said, you should write a book. And in the book, I was able to sort of explain the story behind the article.
After suffering 2 traumatic, life-changing losses, Amy Morin sat down and wrote a letter to herself. It was a list of the 13 things she needed to avoid if she was going to get through one of the lowest points in her life. A few days later, she posted that letter online. Little did she know that her life would literally never be the same. Her books have been translated into more than 30 languages. She's got some really, really valuable insights about mental strength, insights that anyone can use to improve their resilience and their life. This is my conversation with Amy Morin.
Hi, this is Amy.
Hey, how you doing? It's Warren. So thanks very much for making the time to chat. I really appreciate it. I know you're extremely busy. I follow you online and know that you're speaking everywhere, and you're still practicing, I imagine, and writing books. So I'm not sure where you find the time, but thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. I actually took a break from practicing. It was just too crazy. I just didn't have enough hours in the day. So that's helped for sure.
Amazing. So for the folks who may not know you and your backstory, and it's hard to believe that there are people who wouldn't, because I was looking at some of the numbers for the reach of your articles, your books, and specifically the big one, the first one is 13 Things Mentally Strong People Don't Do, is translated into 30 different languages now. And I checked the latest number on your TED Talk. Do you know what it is? Do you know what the number is?
I know it's over 8 million.
It's at 8.4, which is crazy. So congratulations on that success. But for people who don't know how all of this started, there was a series of very sort of traumatic and devastating events within your life that sort of led you to that kitchen table and writing that original list. Would you mind just quickly bringing people through that process, starting with your mom, I suppose?
Yeah, sure. That's fine. When I was 23, I had started my practice as a therapist, and I was really invested in helping other people become mentally strong. And I thought I was going to take everything I'd learned in textbooks and teach people things in my office. And then my mom suddenly passed away when I was 23. And it was my first big loss. And it was the first time I really had to figure out, how do I dig deep? How do I become mentally strong myself? And it just really made me invested in learning more about mental strength from a personal level. And I started studying the people that came into my office to figure out why do some people get better faster? Why do some people struggle more than others? How come some people can go through incredibly hard times and they come out stronger on the other side versus some people who get stuck? When I started studying that, I started noticing, some people it was all about their habits. Some people had really good habits. Some people had habits that were really helpful, but all in all, it was more about what people didn't do. That people who seemed to bounce back, people who seemed to be able to persist longer, they had certain things that they didn't do. And that started me on this path of figuring out what do mentally strong people not do. And then when I was 26, it was 3 years to the day of when my mother passed away, that my 26-year-old husband died of a heart attack. And found myself in the depths of despair, and my heart was broken, and I had to figure out, what do I do now with my life? And fortunately, I learned a lot already just by watching people come into my therapy office, and I knew, which strategies worked better than others, and how to get through grief. And that going through the pain was part of the process. That's part of the healing process. And it took a long time before I started to feel like, okay, I'm starting to heal. I'm starting to feel better. And it was a few years later that I got married again. And I just felt so fortunate to find love, not just once, but twice in my life. And got remarried. And shortly after that, though, my father-in-law was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And I can just remember thinking, this isn't fair. Why do I have to go through this again? And why do I keep losing loved ones? And okay, so I sort of got a grip after a couple of days and thought, that way of thinking isn't helpful. And sat down and I wrote a list of all of the things that mentally strong people don't do. And when I was done, I had the list of 13 things. And it was just a letter to myself that I would read over and over again. And I thought, well, if this is helpful to me, maybe it would help somebody else. And I published it online, and it put me on the path of now I'm talking about mental strength on a much bigger level than I was before.
So the original list, was that just something you wrote for yourself, or did you have the intention to share that? Because I think that it started out as like a blog post or an article, and it just kind of took off on its own, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. So it was really, I had been writing for years. After my husband passed away, I had started writing just as a way to make money. I didn't write about things that were deeply personal. I just wrote sort of sterile articles, sometimes about mental health, but a lot of my articles weren't even about mental health. They were about shipping containers in Duluth, Minnesota, or something like that. And so this one particular article was really the only one that I had written straight from the heart. And I didn't plan on publishing it. I just thought it was for me. But when I realized it was helpful to me, I thought, all right, maybe it will help somebody else. But I really didn't give much context. Nobody knew the backstory of why I wrote it. It was literally just a list of the 13 things with a little explanation of each one. And, before I knew it, it was a couple of days after I wrote it, Forbes magazine picked it up, and pretty soon news stations from across the world were calling me to talk about it. But people thought I wrote it because I'd mastered it. Nobody knew I wrote it because I was struggling with it. So I was thankful that in the course of all of that, a literary agent called and said, you should write a book. And in the book, I was able to sort of explain the story behind the article.
It's amazing that from out of all that pain and comes that moment where you write the list, and then it's changed your life profoundly, I would imagine. Like here you are posting pictures of seeing your book on the shelf in different airports.
Right.
That'd be funny. So there's this old cliche for anyone who's ever gone through hard times. People will tell them, and this has happened to me in previous parts of my life. People will say, time heals all wounds, right? If you just wait long enough, time will dull it or fix it. And there's something in the beginning of the book that says time doesn't heal anything. It's how we deal with the time. And so it's not just the actual passage of time. It's what you do in those moments, or I guess more importantly, what you don't do.
Right. I realized, that whoever said that certainly lied, that time doesn't. And I have so many people that would come into my therapy office and something had happened to them 10 or 20 years ago, and they were still sort of waiting to feel better, but they were being passive about it. They didn't know what to do. And I think our emotional wounds are a lot like physical wounds. If you were to, say, break your leg and then you sit around for 10 years waiting for your leg to feel better, but you don't ever get treatment for it, it's not going to happen, or it's not going to heal correctly. And our emotional wounds are much the same, whether you lose a loved one or you experience a traumatic incident. You have to be proactive about trying to heal, and you have to do a lot of things. And sometimes it's experiments of a little bit of trial and error. I'm going to try this and see if it works. If not, I'm going to try something else. And you really have to be proactive about it, because time alone doesn't heal anything.
So you wrote the book in 2013, 5 years ago. How has your life changed since then?
It's been incredible. So the first year when I was writing the book, I was still working as a therapist. And at some point along the way, media was still calling me 6 months later, and Oprah Magazine calls me, and Fox News, and all of these places. And but I didn't want to give up my job. I loved working as a therapist, and my place of employment was very supportive. They said, go do this. We'll hold your spot for you. If you can go work on your book and then you want to come back to work here, you'll always have a place here. And so I did. And so now, and that was a few years ago. So now I primarily write articles and do speaking engagements. And one book led to another book, and another book led to another one. I have a third book coming out this year. And I now get to travel all over the world and speak to people about mental strength. And I do a lot of the same things I was doing in a therapy office when I was working one-on-one with people. But now I just am able to do it on a much bigger scale. I get to speak to sometimes thousands of people at a time as opposed to just one person in a room.
So do you get the impression that you're able to help more people in this format? Like it's kind of like a practice on steroids.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, just what I remind myself. I get emails from people in foreign countries now. My first book is in 32 languages. So I'll get emails from people in China, or I have somebody in Kenya that's emailing me saying, I really want to read your book, but I can't find it anywhere. And so many people across the globe who don't have access to mental health services. They don't know about things like mental strength. Nobody talks about it. There's a much bigger stigma in those countries than there is here. And I just feel like it's just so rewarding to be able to reach people across the globe. I never imagined I'd be doing this.
So the book right now you posted this on social media as well. So like we're again 5 years out, and for anyone who hasn't picked it up or heard about it yet, it's $1.99, the ebook version on Amazon. So it's like for $2, like the price of less than a coffee, you can grab the book and have it on your phone or on your e-reader. I'm going through the list, right? The 13 things that mentally strong people don't do. And it occurs to me that each one of these, first of all, as I read it, the first thing I think of is, who do I know like this in my life, right? I think that's what a lot of people think. The second thing I think, and it's less pleasant, is when was I like that? And then you can think back to certain little scenes will pop up in your life, and it's interesting how things even from your childhood or from your teen years or certain things in your life occurred. And then the thing that occurs to me is each one of these 13 could probably be their own book as well. Like you could probably fill 200 pages on each one of these.
Yeah, when I was writing the book, I didn't have any trouble coming up with content, and that was it exactly, was cutting down on the content to make each chapter short enough that it was a chapter as opposed to its own book. And the more I talk about it, the more I speak about it, the more stories I hear, the more questions people ask, and then the more content I get. And the problem I had with the second and the third book, too, where I had to cut out tens of thousands of words because I could just keep talking about this forever.
So much. In a way, and I think there's a lesson in here for writers, too, right? You said you've been writing all these sterile articles, which are probably for me, like I'm in the media relations world, and you do a lot of these. It's practical, it's technical. It's like, here's how you do the thing. But it's not like you're opening up your chest and pouring your heart onto the page. And the first time you do that is the one that connects with people in this profound way. So I think there's a lesson in there for content creators and writers as well.
Yeah, I think so too. As a therapist, I was so used to listening to people's problems and hearing their stories and not sharing my own. And I wasn't even going to share it in the book in the beginning. When the literary agent called me and said, you should write a book. And I said, oh, thank you very much. And I'll think about that. But I didn't tell her the backstory until about the second or third conversation that we had. And she said, well, you don't have to share your story, but you might want to think about it. It might give you some more credibility. And, I'm so glad now that I did. I think it would be ridiculous if I hadn't shared the story now. But, I think it's just so important that people can tell. I think when you write something that's from the heart, when it resonates with you, when you can say, this is my experience or this is how I feel, and you're a little bit more vulnerable, it strikes a chord with people versus the sterile articles, which I still write sometimes,
Of course.
5 ways to do this, and what's the problem with anxiety or something like that. And don't necessarily strike a chord, but when you can talk about it in a different way, when it's really your experience and it's from your heart, and people notice that. I
have to ask, you have these you're in your 20s. It's a relatively young age. You lose your mother very unexpectedly and quickly, and then on the third anniversary, you lose your husband, who was I think he was 26 at the time.
Yeah.
And so these two devastating events, and then did you continue to practice for a period after that?
I did. So after my husband had passed away, I took as much time off from work as I could. I was able to tap into some of my benefits, and I took about 2 months off. And that was, in those first 2 months, it was sort of a blur, and it was just a matter of, filling out paperwork and figuring out some very practical things about, getting my husband's phone shut off and that kind of stuff. And my heart still wasn't healed, but I knew that, I couldn't take 4 years off from work either. I was now down to one income. In fact, I needed to earn more money. And so I was so fortunate though because I was a therapist and I worked with therapists. I had the most supportive supervisor, and I know not everybody has that, but I just felt really fortunate. And she taught me so many lessons about, how to treat other people when they're grieving, because I think we're so uncomfortable with it as a society. What do you say to somebody when they've had a loss, and how do you help other people? And there were just so many lessons that I learned and that I've taken with me about what was really helpful during that time. But yeah, I was able to go back to work, and I worked in a small town. So some of my clients who read the paper had an idea of what had gone on if they read the obituary section, or they had just been told I was out because of a family emergency. And so they were then given the option, do you want to see another therapist or do you want to wait for Amy? But we don't really know when Amy's coming back. And everybody except for one person waited for me to come back. And so after 2 months, my boss called and said, we really need to give people a timeline. What are you thinking? And I said, all right, I'll give it a shot. And I went back. And it was tough to go back, but it was kind of nice to be back into the swing of things and to start developing a routine again and to figure out, how do I do this even when my heart's broken? How am I going to help other people? And it took a while to feel like I was back in the groove of it, but it was good for me in the long run for sure.
So as you're sitting there and you have people coming in one after another telling you their problems, and I'm sure some of them were very serious, but some of them are probably, you must be sitting there thinking, you think you got problems? You know what I mean? Like, I know you're professionally trained and everything else, but that's a human reflex. Aren't you thinking that at some point you want to shake these people?
Sure. Definitely there were days where I thought, okay, your boss is kind of mean to you sometimes. That's not the end of the world. But, I also was just reminding me that I was grateful that a lot of people who were dealing with problems, even though in my world, I might think that problem isn't that big of a deal, but this person is truly distressed. And even though it might not seem like it's an insurmountable mountain, to this person, this problem is huge. And they could be in just as much distress as somebody who's facing tragic circumstances. So I really had to keep that in mind as I worked with people so that I could still be effective, that it wasn't a contest of my problems are worse than yours, or, you think you've got problems, listen to what I've been through. That nothing like that was going to be helpful. It was just a matter of knowing, okay, how do I teach somebody skills so that they can deal with whatever life throws their way, no matter how big or how small it is.
Why 13? Did you come up with a number first, or did you just write the list as from your mind, and that's just what it ended up being?
Yeah, I didn't have a number in mind when I just sat down and wrote it, and it just happened to be 13, because people have asked me, like, was it lucky number 13, or, was there magic in the number? And there wasn't. It was just, when I was done, those were the 13 things that I'd just never really written down before. I think I'd learned them over the years. They were things that I really had focused on. I just hadn't seen them all in one place. And when I was done writing the list, there just happened to be 13 on them.
Is there one of the 13 that you hear about or that people ask you about the most? Like, is there one that kind of bubbles up more than the others?
The one that seems to always come up the most is number 2, that mentally strong people don't give away their power. And that one is really about saying, okay, I'm in charge of how I think, feel, and behave, and people around me can't necessarily drag me down. They don't have the power to make me feel bad about myself, or my boss doesn't make me feel bad about who I am, or my mother-in-law doesn't necessarily have to drive me nuts. It's up to me to decide how I think, feel, and behave. And it's incredible to me that when I talk about this subject, and this is the chapter I get the most emails about too, is people will say, I didn't even realize, this person in my life, whether it's their neighbor or their friend or their sister-in-law, they say, I gave that person just too much power in my life. And it was really about setting healthier boundaries and taking back your power and empowering yourself to say, it's up to me to decide how I spend my time, who I spend it with, and how I live my life.
The next book that you did, the follow-up one, was 13 Things That Mentally Strong Parents Don't Do. If you had 30 seconds to give a parent a tip, and I guess, kids of different ages have different challenges, but what would be your biggest tip to help cultivate resilience in a child?
I would say don't take responsibility for their emotions. Instead, teach them how to be responsible. So instead of, when your child's upset, instead of calming them down, teach them how to calm themselves down. Or when they're in a bad mood, don't just cheer them up, but teach them how to cheer themselves up. And I think then you give kids a gift for life, that they can use those skills as they grow up, and they don't depend on you to regulate their emotions.
So on the theme of resilience, which is really that's the thread through all of your books. You call it mental strength, resilience, whatever. It's sort of the same thing. Do you think that as a society, and obviously this is a generalizing statement, but do you think as a society that we are less resilient than we were generations ago?
Yes. And I think, one positive thing is, gosh, we don't have to deal with a lot of struggles and a lot of things that generations before us had to worry about. But on the other hand, we have things that I think makes life a little too easy sometimes, like electronics. I see so many kids with anxiety these days, and I think part of it is because they spend 9, 10 hours a day in front of their electronics. And so they don't have to deal with being bored, or they don't have to deal with being lonely. They just sort of escape any sort of uncomfortable emotion with their smartphones or tablets or video games. And that's one of my big concerns, is that because of that, we're not raising kids to be as resilient as they could be.
And while it might seem obvious, I'd like to get your thoughts on the benefits of resilience at all. For most people, most days of their lives will be fine. They'll go to school, they'll go to work, that something good happens, something not so good happens. But every now and then, you get those A-bomb days where something happens to your career, you lose a loved one, something along those lines. And a lot of times, if the people don't have the skills or the ability to deal with those appropriately, then their life can take a really dramatic turn, and that can have ripple effects on people and their families and whatnot. So I'd like to get your thoughts just on the importance of it. Like in the title of the book and in the content, it's just sort of assumed that this is a good thing. But what happens when you don't have mental strength? What are some of the risks and some of the downfalls?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big misconceptions. People tend to think, well, I need mental strength because of a single tragedy that might happen to me, or I need to toughen my kids up just because something horrible might happen. But we really need resilience on an everyday basis. So whether you're dealing with a traffic jam, a flat tire, or some sort of conflict at work, resilience helps you in all of those sorts of things, in everyday trials, everyday problems. And it helps you manage your stress better. It can help you to live a happier and a healthier life. When you look at the studies about resilient people, they tend to live longer, they tend to live happier, tend to be more successful in so many areas. You can have better relationships. I mean, the list goes on, but it's really about saying, how do you be resilient to any kind of stress in life, even those little bumps in the road?
So you mentioned one of the things you said earlier is that when you wrote the list, people assumed that you had mastered these things, and that you were saying, like, this is me kind of just working through my own stuff. At this point, 5 years out and having the professional training that you do you still struggle with some of these things on an ongoing basis?
Oh, absolutely. I think when life is going well, it's easy to say, I don't do any of those 13 things. Well, then what happens when you hit a bump in the road? Or, as an author now, when I see my book out there in the world, then there's still days where I see other people whose books are doing way better, and I think, oh, that's not fair, or how come my book can't be like that? Or when I go out to do a speaking engagement and I see, somebody else who comes out on stage and does what I would say is a really incredible job, and then sometimes I start to doubt myself. Or I definitely have lots of times in my life, but now obviously I'm hyper aware of it because all I do is speak and write and think about these things. So I can definitely catch it. And then it's about reframing it. Because I think it's not like it's a checklist of things you either do or you don't. If we were honest, I think we all do these things sometimes. And it's just a matter of being more aware of it and then deciding, how do you respond to it when you catch yourself heading down that path, so that you don't get caught up in a negative cycle of, say, feeling sorry for yourself and then thinking your life is awful and then staying stuck, and that you just can interrupt that cycle and say, how do I turn this around now before I start heading down that path too far?
So I'm in Canada, and I was driving down the road about a year ago, and I remember hearing a story that emergency room admissions for children, let's say under the age of 16, had increased by 50% for mental health specifically. So emergency room admissions for mental health reasons had increased by 50% since 2007. And so while no one seems to have put a reason on that, it occurs to me that that's the same year that Facebook came out. And that, I'm not saying that there's a direct connection between these two things, but do you think that social media, because when looking at your list, a lot of the things you say people don't do, it seems to me that when you're stuck on your phone 8, 9, 10 hours a day, a lot of these things are a direct directly in opposition to where you want to be going. For example, we've all got the friends posting, everything they do, everything they eat, the curated family shots, everybody's happy and smiley. And over time, this probably is going to make people feel a little bit shitty about their own lives. You know what I mean? So do you think social media overall is negative in this way?
I do. Study after study will show that the more time you spend on Facebook, the more convinced you'll become that other people are happier than you are. And when they've looked at other studies like envying people on Facebook, which most people tend to do because, as you say, everybody else's life looks perfect, it's directly linked to depression. And Instagram is supposedly one of the worst social media outlets for our mental health because you're just looking at images. So you're just looking at, happy, healthy, fit people who look like they have it all. And when you surround yourself with that for hours a day, it really takes a toll on how you think, how you feel, how you behave. And so I think, and I'm not against social media, I definitely use social media, but I think we just need to be mindful of how we're using it and how we're allowing kids to consume it, and how do you set healthy boundaries and limits for yourself when you're on it.
It makes me think this would probably be a horrible idea, but wouldn't it be great if there was just some social media platform that every hour it just took a random snapshot of whatever you actually are doing, just posted online?
I think that would be great. And we could actually see, what people really look like when they aren't, they are only choosing one out of 1,500 selfies, the one where they look the best or the one where they look like they're having fun. And you can see families who just pose for a photo and then they go back to fighting, as soon as the picture's done. And you just think, okay, what if we just captured real life? I think then we would think a little bit differently about our own lives and about other people's lives if we had a realistic view. So I think that'd be a wonderful idea. Unfortunately, probably nobody would sign up to do it.
Exactly. That's an app that everybody would want to watch, but nobody would sign up for, unfortunately.
Right.
Going through the list as well, it occurs to me that this is when I look at a lot of these things, the word millennials pops up in my head. And I think that in a lot of ways, millennials get a bad rap for the entitlement and all those sorts of things. But do you think that overall, and I'm sure you've worked with people of all different ages, and I know you've done a lot of stuff with youth, do you think millennials get a bad rap?
I do. I think, every generation thinks the next generation is not going to be as good. And we always say, this is going to be the end of the world as we know it. And I think millennials, just because they've grown up with technology, we tend to think ill of them. And I think they're going to shake things up and make some changes. And I think a lot of those changes are going to be positive. We just have to be willing to adjust. I think so many people are really stuck in the way life is right now. And we fear that change. And so I think millennials are going to change quite a bit about the world, and that can be a great thing.
So I'd like to talk about number one a little bit. Number one tip is they don't waste time feeling sorry for themselves. And I think that anyone who listens to that or hears that line or reads it will think of at least a few people in their own lives that they're aware of who just have that sort of that pity party, as you call it, on an ongoing basis. Because everybody can be given a set of circumstances or challenges or whatever, and big, small, whatever. But it's a matter of what do you do with that? Do you take action and try to fix the situation and address it? Or do you sit there and feel sorry for yourselves? And this is the quote that I was talking about earlier, the John Gardner one. I think it's right at the beginning of your book. It says, "Self-pity is easily the most destructive of the non-pharmaceutical narcotics. It's addictive. It provides momentary pleasure, and it separates the victim from reality." Do you see a lot of that in your work, in your life, with your readers? Just how big of a problem is this?
I think it's a pretty big problem. In my therapy office, I would see it quite often. People would come in and say, "Okay, I'm ready to make some changes in my life. Here I am. Let's do this." But then it was like every week they just wanted to tell me all the reasons why they couldn't do their therapy homework or all the problems that cropped up over the week. And while I could certainly sympathize with that, on the other hand, if they weren't willing to do anything about it, they weren't going to make any changes and their life was never going to change. And I've certainly run into this in my personal life as well, that I have friends who will dwell on the negative, or you ask them how their day was and they only tell you the worst of the worst, or every day they could come up with 10 bad things that happen. And I think it's important to set boundaries with people. It's hard to do, but if we just attend people's pity parties every day, we're not really doing them a favor. And it's not necessarily your job to educate people on, being more positive or anything like that. But sometimes it's important to be aware of these sort of energy vampires, the people that call you because they're having a crisis. You offer some advice, and then they say, well, that won't work for me. Here's why. And they can just keep coming up with problems, or they just are the exception to the rule, or for whatever reason, they've dug themselves in deeper and deeper and deeper, and now they can't find a way out. And those people can be really draining, and it's important to recognize that and set limits. And that's not to say you shouldn't be with people when they're in the midst of a crisis. You certainly should, but just make sure that your role is supporting them and getting out of the problem, not staying stuck in it.
So I'm sure you've got some theories on this, and again, you've got years and years of education and practice, and you're professionally trained in this area. Do you think that human beings are innately wired for happiness, or do you think that we're innately wired to be dissatisfied?
I think we are probably trained more to look for the problems because we're just have to be on alert to look out for danger. You have to look out for the obstacles. And back in the day, you needed to do all of that so that you could stay alive. And our lives now are much less about life or death. Instead, we're just more worried about, what type of ice cream you have in the freezer. And so I think it just takes a while for ourselves to realize, okay, I'm not hardwired. I'm hardwired in a way that's going to constantly make me look out for danger. I'm going to look out for the bad stuff so I can stay alive. But you don't need that for the most part anymore. And that now you have the options of what you want to eat for dinner. You don't have to go out and forage for your food, but instead you got a freezer full of food. And just keeping that in mind, I think sometimes can help us say, okay, how do you make conscious decisions every day that will help you to live a happier and healthier life?
So every year on the anniversary of your husband's passing, you say you go on some sort of adventure. I think that's the word you call it. Where did that come from, that idea to sort of honor him in that way? And do you think that this is something that other people could or should do? And what do you think the benefits are of that?
Yeah, so it was my husband passed away in February. His birthday was in June. So as we were coming up to what would have been his 27th birthday, I thought, gosh, I don't want to go to work that day. But if I just sit at home, I'm going to stare at the walls, and that's not good for me either. What am I going to do that day? So I asked my mother-in-law, what are you going to do that day? And she said, what do you think about skydiving? And if this is a woman, she was in her mid-50s and wasn't anybody who would ever jump out of a plane, I didn't think. And I thought, that's an interesting idea, because Lincoln had been really this adventurous soul, and he was always up for an adventure, and he was spontaneous and that kind of stuff. So we thought, all right, let's do this. Let's honor his memory. Let's go jump out of an airplane. And so that's what we did. And in fact, his grandmother, who was in her 80s at the time, she just had cataract surgery, so her doctor wouldn't let her, but she was in on it. She's like, oh, I'm totally going to do this. And so that year it was just my mother-in-law and myself who did it. And it was just a wonderful experience. It just made me feel alive again. It reminded me, okay, I have choices in how I live. I could sit home and just feel sorry for myself, or I can get out there and do stuff. And we still do that to this day. And we still find some sort of adventure to go on. We swam with sharks. We've ridden mules into the Grand Canyon. We always look for an adventure, and we start planning it usually a year in advance. And now friends and family and lots of people join us on a lot of these adventures. And it's turned into a day that we look forward to, and a day that we sort of honor his memory in a way that makes us smile rather than forces us to feel sorry for ourselves. And I share that story in my book. And since then, I've had so many readers write to me about what they're doing because they've started something similar. I had one family who had lost a loved one who loved to golf. So every year, the whole family gets together and goes golfing on this person's birthday. Or I had another woman who went through a really nasty divorce. And on the anniversary of her divorce every year, she said she would just sit at home and cry, and she had a horrible day. And so now she's decided on that day she's going to go to a spa, she's going to go shopping, she's going to treat herself to something really nice. And, I think that doing something like that, just to honor something, a really difficult day in your life, just to say, how am I going to take charge? How am I going to be empowered to be in control of how I spend my time? And that's not to say you shouldn't feel sad or you shouldn't grieve, because all of those emotions are helpful. But self-pity is when you start to think, my life is worse than anybody else's, and there's nothing I can do about this. And so choosing to do something with a really rough day can just be a way to empower yourself to say, how do I want to live my life? What do I want it to be like? How am I going to take charge of my time to make this the best possible day that I can?
Do you get emails from people who've been impacted by your book or who have made changes in their lives? Like, I'm sure you know, having that kind of reach, you must. But are there any that stand out? Any stories or people from different countries? Anything that pops up in your mind?
Yeah, I do. I get emails from people all the time. It's just so humbling to read them. But I think a story that actually just occurred last week, there's a former NFL player who has been suicidal at certain times in his life. And he said he was to the point that he had a plan and he was ready to kill himself. And he came across my book and he decided that he wasn't going to go through with it. And and it really credits my book with saving his life. And if my book played any part in that, I'm just so humbled and honored and grateful. And I knew that he liked my work and that he enjoyed my book, but I didn't know that it had affected him that deeply until just last week. I was shared the stage with him, and he got on stage and shared the story. And I was just so filled with gratitude that he was willing to share that story with people. And to think that just the idea of mental strength, if that message on mental strength could affect somebody that much, I just am so humbled by that.
That's amazing. Do people know who this guy is, or?
Yeah, so Lawrence Jackson, he's a retired football player at this point, and has really talked about what it's like to go from being an NFL player to then retiring, and how do you find your identity? And he's been very open with the struggles that he's had with depression over the years and how difficult it's been. But he's sort of rebuilt this life now where he is an entrepreneur. He starts all these businesses and he's really giving back to his community, and he's found more meaning and purpose in what he does every day. And he feels like football was the means that led him to this. And now he's feels like he's really able to give back to the community in a meaningful way.
We talked about children earlier, social media issues. Anxiety is a word that keeps popping up, and I've been reading some of your articles and things that you have online, and anxiety seems to be a common theme. Do you see more of that today, or are you hearing more about that with parents and their kids? Just that anxiousness.
Yeah, definitely. People will often say to me, depression must be what you see the most, but it wasn't. Anxiety. And certainly since my career started in 2003, compared to the later years of my career, seeing way more anxiety than anything else. And especially with kids, younger and younger. Sometimes I was seeing 6, 7, and 8-year-olds who had debilitating anxiety. And parents were beside themselves. You know, what do I do? How do I manage my kid's life? Do I push them to do things that are anxiety provoking, or do I not? And anxiety is treatable, but most people wait a really long time before they get treatment, adults especially. Sometimes I think the average is something like 10 years before people reach out and get help for anxiety. And it can be one of the most debilitating issues, but at the same time, it's one of the most treatable ones. And to always encourage people, if you think that you're struggling with anxiety, if it's starting to affect the way you live your life, by all means, go out there and get some help, talk to a professional.
So why do you think the increase in anxiety is taking place? It just seems to be spiking. Do you have any theories or ideas?
Yeah, I think a lot of it, again, goes back to our electronics. You know, kids are less likely to play outside. They're much more likely to play indoors on their electronics. And we know that outdoor play is huge, being in nature, running around in the grass, those kinds of things are all natural buffers against mental health issues. And the same for adults. Rather than going out and having coffee with your friends, or rather than going out and going on a hike with your pals, maybe you're more likely to sit at home and be on social media. And we know that this social connections are huge and that we need social support, but connections over social media aren't the same as face-to-face interaction. So I think that's one of the huge problems that we're seeing right now, is that we're spending so much time connecting with people online versus sitting down with people face to face, that we're not getting the same results as we would as if we spent more time with humans in person.
Oh, for sure. There's a quote from your book: being mentally strong doesn't mean you don't have negative thoughts. It means you don't give those thoughts power over you. And I guess that speaks in a way to sort of point 2 of the book. But I think it taps into the fact that everybody does have these thoughts on a day-to-day basis. But it's a matter of, what do you do with that steering wheel? Which way do you go? Do you have any advice for people dealing with negative thoughts, whether it's thoughts of self-doubt, or, you know, I'm not good enough, or bad things are going to happen? Do you have any quick ideas or hacks or tips for those folks?
Yeah, because I think it's easy to look around the room and think everybody else is more confident than I am, or everybody else is more comfortable in their own skin, or I'm not as good, all of those sorts of things. So I think when you're imagining something bad happening, argue the opposite. Think about all the good things that could happen to sort of balance out the thoughts of those catastrophic predictions that you might make. And the other thing is, when you catch yourself thinking negatively, ask yourself, what would I say to a friend who had this problem? We tend to be way nicer to other people than we are ourselves. And when you just practice talking to yourself like a trusted friend, you can reassure yourself, you can give yourself more sound advice, you balance out your emotions with logic, which is really the key to thinking more logically and healthier.
What is one tactical thing that someone could do in their life, like in the spirit of just making small changes that kind of build up over time, in addition to the 13 things to not do? What would be one thing that you would tell people that they should do if they want to take better control of their mental strength or their mental health?
A really simple, easy one is to practice gratitude. If you kept a notebook next to your bed, you write down 3 things that you're grateful for every day. Studies will show that you'll sleep better, you'll sleep more soundly, you tend to experience better physical health, better mental health, you might live longer, you have better social connections with people. I mean, the list goes on, and it takes you maybe 2 minutes of your time at the most and doesn't cost you any money.
So you have I think it's your 3rd book coming out. It is 13 Things Mentally Strong Women Don't Do. Where did the idea for this come? Obviously, there's this kind of this theme or series of books that are coming out and having great success. Why specifically the women one? And when is this book going to be coming out? When can people purchase it?
My books, sort of the follow-ups, have really been led by what my readers ask for. So when my readers kept asking, how do we raise mentally strong kids? I came out with a parenting book. And then as we were approaching the publishing date for the parenting book, I just kept getting so many questions from women. Some were moms who'd read the parenting book. Some were just women who were saying, in light of what's going on in the world right now, how do we be mentally strong? Or what does that look like? We see a lot of, say, Navy SEALs out there talking about toughness and what it means to be tough. And women were saying, well, can't women be strong too? Or what does it look like to be a mentally strong woman? And can you still be nurturing and caring and conscientious of your emotions and all of that sort of thing and be strong? And so I approached my publisher and we had a conversation about what the next book would be, and it just seemed to make sense to write the women's edition.
Well, Amy Morin, I want to say thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate you sharing your story and answering some of those questions. All the best to you, and we'll talk to you later.
Thank you so much.
Thank you once again to Amy Morin for taking the time to chat with me. Her new book is now available, so I really encourage you to pick that up. If you like this episode, please take a second to subscribe to the show or to leave a review on Apple Podcasts. It would mean a lot to me, and it'll help other people find the show. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you next time.